Dr. Atchison here, and we're talking about Chapter 4, Recognizing Visual Objects. This is our first lecture where we're going to cover the information about the considerations we need for recognizing visual objects and the fundamental steps for recognizing visual objects. So, a few basic considerations we need to think about is how does the visual system figure out what object is familiar? It has to match a representation to that of memory. So when you see a glass, you have to match that visual input of the shape and curvature of the glass and the edges of the glass and the light reflection of the glass to the representation in your mind of what a glass is. But the visual system also has to be able to do this with unfamiliar objects. And you have to be able to it has to be able to take these unfamiliar objects and allow them to be manipulated in a variety of ways. There's some complications to this. This sounds pretty easy. It sounds like kind of matching up puzzle pieces, turning the puzzle piece around and figuring out where it matches. However, our visual arrays are usually pretty complex. So these slides I like to say, image clutter, object variety, variable views, oh my! Each of these representations is a complication for the system. It makes it harder to identify objects in our environment, and we have to resolve these conflicts. So the first one I want to talk about is image clutter. This is the idea that objects are recognized when they're seen kind of in a jumble. So even though we don't see the entire object of, say, a glass or a book or a picture on the wall or a building behind a tree, we still recognize that that's a house behind that tree or that's a car behind that tree, even though we only see a part of it, even though there's occlusions. There's a lot of different images and they're all cluttered together, and we can still distinguish these. So again, most scenes, such as this one, are this kind of clutter of objects in this 3D space. Me personally, recording this video lecture, my desk is definitely a similar clutter of this 3D space. Yet I can see where my computer is, I can see where my phone is, where my planner is, where the textbook is, where my glass is, even though all of these things overlap each other. I can see my iPad buried beneath two different notepads. I mean, I can recognize it as my iPad, even though it is mostly occluded by other objects. So I don't see the entire shape of these things. So the image of the iPad isn't a complete image of the iPad. It's an incomplete version on my retinal image. Yet somehow I still know that it's my iPad. So next let's talk about object variety. In that image you just saw, there was a whole bunch of different types of objects, and there's different varieties of the same object. So when I say, my phone's on my desk in this kind of image clutter, well, what kind of phone am I talking about? Am I talking about a cell phone? Am I talking about a smartphone? Am I talking about a flip phone? Am I talking about a rotary dial? Am I talking about a cordless telephone? What kind of phone am I talking about? Yet you'll be able to recognize any of those objects as a phone, despite this object variety. So here's just an example of kind of the many different types of objects we have. Here we have our red rotary phone. That's not the image that I have on my visual field, but I can again recognize both of those objects, either my smartphone or this red rotary dial that's in the center here, as a phone. And I can do this almost instantaneously. I don't necessarily need to think, okay, well, what is that? And compare it against kind of my idea of these things. And part of this is comes out of sort of cognition and comes out of categorization. So this idea of categorization is how we can recognize that all of these, despite the fact that they all look very different and they all have very different angles and they have different lighting and they have different shapes, that they are all recognized as a tree. That any given category has multiple different exemplars. We talked about the different kinds of phones, the different kinds of trees, and yet your visual system recognizes that as part of that. It can match it to that category. The final one of these that we want to talk about of these complications is variable views. That we can recognize these objects even when they're presented from unfamiliar vantage points. Sometimes the more unfamiliar the vantage point is, the more difficult it could be, but ultimately we can still typically recognize these things. So here's an example from your textbook. These are all different representations, different versions, variable views of the Brooklyn Bridge. So we have different retinal images for each one of these pictures, and some of them are based on perspective, so how far away you are, orientation. Some of them are taken from underneath, some of them are taken from on the bridge, some of them are taken from the water, some of them are taken from the air. Lighting, some of them are in the day, some of them are in the night. There's all these different factors, but if you're familiar with the Brooklyn Bridge, you will recognize this as the Brooklyn Bridge. So the fundamental steps to for our visual system, for recognizing visual objects, is we have to do the following components. And we're going to approach this starting out from this bottom-up perspective. Okay, so the first thing we have to do from this bottom-up perspective is identify edges. We have to then identify regions bounded by those edges. So what are their edges of what? Okay, and then in lecture 2, we'll talk about where these boundaries, where they are, and what is the image, what is the figure, versus what is the background, what is the ground. And we'll talk about that in the next video. Then we're going to have to be able to group similar regions, and this is done through perceptual grouping that we'll talk about in video 4.3. And finally, how do we handle missing information? How do we fill this in through perceptual interpolation, which is done in lecture 4.3 as well. And we put all these perceptual organization steps together. We identify the edges and the boundaries and figure out what's the background and what's the object. We've grouped these things. We can fill in any missing things, such as from image clutter and those sorts of things. And finally, we'll get to object recognition, which we'll talk about in the last lecture. And this is that higher level processing where we can fully recognize the object by matching them to their representations from our stored memory. So to begin this process, again, the first 2 steps were about edges. How do we take this image of these 7 wooden blocks and figure out which one is what? Where the edges are. There are 31 distinct regions that are bounded by edges, and this image has uniform brightness and color. Your visual system has to break this apart. And your visual system says, okay, well, 1 through 28, and if you pause this video and look through this or look at it in your book, 1 through 28 are part of the object's surface. But 29 through 31 aren't. They're part of the background. But they provide just as much information as 1 through 28 did. And your visual system has to parse this information. Where are these edges and these borders? What is then making up the shape? What are the shapes? So that we can see this as these 7 distinct blocks. The first step in this organization is to represent these scenes. This is done through that ventral pathway that we talked about, that what pathway, and it extracts those edges from the visual field. This is happening in the neuron areas V1, 2, and 4, again, and that's part of that ventral pathway where we can do what? Remember, ventral is the bottom side of the brain, so we'll go through the IT cortex, we'll have those different modules for places and faces, those sorts of things. And we know that lateral inhibition plays a role in this, in determining the edges of an object as well. And once your brain determines these edges are there, we have to divide them into areas of uniform connectedness. This is where your brain says, okay, well, these things seem pretty similar, so I think that they're part of the same thing. So it's again saying, okay, lighting, color, all of these things, they have uniform properties regardless of what they are. And so our brain is saying, okay, I think that these are part of one object. How we do this, we talked about in chapter 3, where your retinal image can be broken up into different curvatures, different lines, shading, and we can do this edge extraction, where the visual system determines the location, orientation, and curvature of edges in that retinal image. And remember, we talked a lot about this in chapter 3 when we were talking about those various areas of the visual brain. So when we're looking at different images, how do we perceive, when we look at image A, how do we perceive that A is more like D than it is like B? When we have this variation in shading, where we have areas that are very, very dark, if you look at the right-hand side of the bowl where it meets that shadow on the right, those colors are almost identical. And where it meets the background of that black, is the shading and the illumination is almost identical, and we have black. So why does our brain not see that shape like B? Instead, it sees those shapes like C or D. The answer is figure to ground. And figure to ground processing is what we're going to be talking about in the next lecture, 4.2. Thanks.